Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lecture 9 in the series of Philosophy of Science in Economics. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last few months and weeks, we have covered a number of things. And of course, starting with the concepts of ontology, epistemology, going into issues of metaphysics. We also had an opportunity to get exposed to hermeneutics. And today I want to continue with the topic that we discussed in the previous two lectures, and that is Lecture 7 and Lecture 7 and Lecture 8. And we just didn't conclude our discussion. If you recall, in Lecture 7 and Lecture 8, we started our topic of realism and anti-realism about economics. So that's where we are going to pick from today. I gave you a number of books that I want you to read, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you have had an opportunity to read those books. One of them is a book that was written by Austin, 1962, How to Do Things with Words. Then I also gave you another book on the invisible hand of economics, a book that is published by Routledge. Then I gave you another book published by Basker, A Realist Theory of Science. And then another book that you have to read deals with the laws, causation, and economic methodology. And then, of course, another book which deals with macroeconomics is Macroeconomics for Real. And that is found in the Real Economic Worldview. Then I also gave you another book on econometrics and reality, in fact and fiction in economics. So it deals with models, realism, and social construction. And remember, what we are discussing now again takes us into the socially constructed reality. Do not forget to read the works of Marquis, Scientific Realism and Ontology, ladies and gentlemen. So the books are so many, and it's your responsibility to look them up and read, ladies and gentlemen. So that topic of realism and anti-realism about economics had a number of aspects that I promised to cover. I gave you the introduction, scientific realism in conventional philosophy of science, ingredients of a minimal scientific realism, and of course another aspect that we are supposed to cover is common sensibles and their modifications before we move into the socially constructed reality in economics. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we cover that item 4 that we are unable to cover, and that is common sensibles and their modifications in economic modeling. So today we'll be looking at aspects of isolation by idealization. I'll also proceed and give you excerpts and critiques of Friedman's 1953 essay. And then we shall move to what we call closed systems. And around that time, we'll be able to discuss ontology versus methodology. And then we shall conclude by looking at modeling the invisible hand mechanism. And of course, these aspects have been at the center of the controversies that surround economics, and that's why we are discussing the philosophy of science in economics. Ladies and gentlemen, when we are dealing with the issues that relates to common sensibles last time, I did tell you that there is no radical departure, or what you may call radical ontological departure from the realm of common sense items. So economics deals with common sense issues, really. as I articulated to you in the previous two lectures. So when we start talking about economics, there is no serious, radical, ontological departure from the realm of common sense items. And even when we move away from issues of bounded rationality to issues of perfectly rational agents, I mean, we are still talking about common sense issues, ladies and gentlemen. And I also told you that economics is one of the highly contested field, and therefore a number of controversies have come to the fore, ladies and gentlemen. So I did also tell you in the previous lectures that these issues of common sense that we are talking about are modified by cognitive operations. So those operations that go on unnoticed and take place in our minds, in our psyche, etc., somehow modify the common sensibles. So our common sensibles are modified by cognitive operations. And these common sensibles that we saw included things like selection, they include things like omission, they include things like abstraction, idealization, simplification, aggregation, and averaging, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, it is possible, ladies and gentlemen, to turn the doubts that we discussed, the doubts about economics and common sense, it's very, very possible to turn those doubts about common sensibles into doubts about existence. And we are talking about realism. And of course, here, not only do the idealizing modifications of ordinary items take them away from the common sense realm, but they are taken away also from the realm of existence. So therefore, those idealized entities are fictions rather than candidates for real things. And that's why at that material time I told you in the previous lectures that the philosophically minded economist called Fries Matchlap has suggested an important idea, and that's the idea I'm going to again put forward to you. So Matchlap in 1967 gave a very nice, interesting example and discussion about the marginalist theory of the perfectly competitive firm. So, Matchlap used that example, and we know very well that he was the neoclassical or probably a person who attempted to promote some of the theories that are in that category, right? So Matchlap gives an example of the neoclassical or marginalist theory of the perfectly competitive firm. And Matchlap says that this competitive firm that is talked about by economics is a firm that is really fictional in nature. So Matchlap says that the firms that are mentioned in this neoclassical theory are firms which are devoid of internal structures. Matchlap also says that these are firms which are perfectly informed, and that these are firms which are taken as taking price signals, and price signals could be considered as the only source of information. And therefore, he says that this theory here, which is the neoclassical theory, also depicts firms as not interacting through rivalry, and also depicts firms as price takers rather than price makers, and it depicts firms as pursuing maximum profits as their only goal. And Matchlab says this is misleading. Matchlab's reasoning is straightforward in concluding that in the neoclassical theory of the competitive firm, all firms are pure fictions. He also says that the theory postulates this purely fictitious, single-minded firm. So he really believes that this firm does not exist. Now, Matchlab continues to warn. So he warns against failing to keep apart these fictional theoretical firms and the familiar real organizations that we can call firms. So the real firms do exist, but unfortunately, when theories are being developed, once in a while, economists only look at fictitious firms because some of the things that are mentioned are not realistic at all. So they lose this realistic perspective. So, and that's the ontological perspective. So the ontological foundations of the theories of the epistemic aspects presented by economists are very problematic here. And therefore, we need to really think very, very hard as economists so that we are able to move away from that kind of thinking and embrace new forms of philosophy that will help us explain reality out there. So when we talk about ontology, talking about the nature of reality out there, and when we talk about epistemology, the nature of knowledge that exists. So what is knowledge? How do we know that we know? And what are those particular aspects that constitute knowledge? Is knowledge one? Or probably many in this case. Therefore, Matchlab continues to say that in the old style, instrumentalist manner, it is just an intermediate variable, right, that serves useful functions in scientific inference without itself being connected to any real entities. So those aspects that are brought about by economists, right, and when they are studying that fictitious firm, right, they depict the old style perspective of dealing with things, and therefore those aspects which are considered, they seem to be intermediate variables without, of course, being connected to any real entities in this case. So, of course, again, when you look at the works of Mackey, 1998, I asked you to read that book. This conclusion, which is given by Matchlab, certainly, derives from an implicit premise, the description theory of reference. And Mackey actually tries to relate the Matchlab's work and the description theory of preference. Now, when Mackey talks about the description theory of preference, he says that according to this theory, the factual reference of a term is determined by the associated descriptions. And he also goes ahead and says that whenever those descriptions do not fit with anything we see in the world, then the term fails to refer, and therefore even the theories may not actually be applicable. So the term firm in this case, which is really described by economists, right, in the neoclassical theory of the competitive firm, fails to refer to real firms simply because the assumption of the theory are not true of any real entities in the social world. And that has implications, again, when we are developing knowledge. So what is knowledge? Knowledge is referred to as justified true beliefs. So the issue of truth must be there. The issue of beliefs must be there. And justification, in other words, we must provide reasons for believing that kind of knowledge. Now, in a situation where entities are fictitious, fictional farms being presented with wrong assumptions, then you cannot really talk about a body of knowledge. So this is why the assumption cannot be used for identifying any real objects of reference, ladies and gentlemen. So MATLAB's suggestion fits well with the discussion that we are pursuing today. So MATLAB's suggested primary use of farm is attributive, ladies and gentlemen. So, for example, he says, just as I can be mistaken about your age and shoe size and still be talking about you, economists may employ false assumptions about farms and yet talk about these farms. You can imagine the assumptions are wrong, the descriptions are wrong, but they still talk about those farms. And that's why MATLAB says, just as I can be mistaken about your age and even your shoe size, right, and still be talking about you. So economists employ false assumptions about farms and yet talk about farms. And that is really paradoxical in nature, especially when we are constructing knowledge. So as you can see, once a reference to real things is secured, we are ready to ask for the rationale for false descriptions. So very soon we shall be asking these people to tell us exactly what they mean. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, when we go to the theory of reference as well, which Machi talks about, the literature in the theory of reference usually cites error, right? The literature in the theory of reference usually cites ignorance. The literature in the theory of reference usually cites incompleteness as sources of falsehood. However, when an economist makes unrealistic assumptions, he or she is often not making an error or ignorant. These people know exactly what they are doing and what they are referring to in these theories. So that economist is instead deliberately employing strategic falsehoods in order to attain some epistemic and pragmatic gains. So this is the point of idealization that we are talking about. And this is a concept that we call isolation by idealization. So if we continue with this concept, ladies and gentlemen, in 19th century economics, it was popular to think of economic theory as focusing on just a limited set of causally relevant factors and to examine the consequences of their functioning in the absence of other factors. And that is in the abstract, ladies and gentlemen. But a more concrete account of the empirical world, ladies and gentlemen, today would require further incorporating causes that also contribute to the shaping of the phenomenon. And that's the position that we must take up, ladies and gentlemen. I know that when we try to emphasize variations in the continued growth of the discipline in economics, ladies and gentlemen, we really refer to the image of economic theorizing. Now, the image of economic theorizing in economics has been certainly contributed to by a number of scholars. You can talk about Stuart Mill in 1832, who had ideas about the decomposition and the composition of causes. Karl Marx, you remember Karl Marx in 1858, he entertained a Hegelian dialectics of the abstract and the concrete. Then, of course, Carl Menger in 1883, who pursued economics as what he called an exact science. But we also know that Alfred Marshall in 1890, he explicitly employed the ceteris paribus cause. and so on. Those are not the only ones, but in the interest of time, we cannot really enumerate all of these fellows and tell you exactly what they have contributed to. So I'll ask you during your free time, ladies and gentlemen, to look up those writings and try to understand the discipline of economics and how it has grown, so that we understand the kind of task we have ahead of us as young scholars in contributing to the development of the discipline. So, but we see from those fellows that I've just given you, Karl Menger, Karl Marx, Alfred Marshall, all those fellows plus a number of others, right? So they actually conceived economic theories in terms of premises that were believed to be true, even if these premises were incomplete. And that worked. And these premises, agents were described as selfish and seeking nothing but maximization of wealth. And if you recall very well, they considered returns in agriculture as diminishing. So they were looking at returns in agriculture as diminishing. So they were described as diminishing, and so on, ladies and gentlemen. Just to refer you to the works of Kearns, 1888, and that's quite some time back. If you read the works of that scholar actually says, positively true to assert that men desire wealth, that they seek according to their lights the easiest and the shortest means by which to attain their ends, and that consequently they desire to obtain wealth with the least exertion of labor possible. I think you can see the thinking here from the works of Kearns in 1888, that man is generally selfish, right? Seeking nothing but maximization of wealth. And this was a premise that was made by that scholar and a number of other scholars, right? So it was incomplete, but unfortunately, it came to the fore. And fortunately, ladies and gentlemen, it guides and it has guided the development of the discipline, ladies and gentlemen. So I'll continue to give you the works of Kearns and what he says. On the other hand, Kearns says that surely possible that the premises should be true and yet incomplete. True so far as the facts which they assert go, and yet including all the conditions which affect the actual cause of events. And that is just an excerpt, ladies and gentlemen. So you can say that Kearns also, in one way or the other, accepts that what is being given here is incomplete. So the premises are taken to be true and yet incomplete. But here, Kearns says true so far as the facts which they assert go, and yet not including all the conditions which affect the actual cause of events. Now, ladies and gentlemen, since not all causal influential factors are covered by a theory, its implications cannot be expected to match the phenomenon. Now, the factors covered by the theory in the real world combined with other factors not included in the theory. Therefore, its implications are true hypothetically only. And that's why we need to understand this concept of idealization in the common sensibles, ladies and gentlemen. Kearns, again, 1888, continues to assert, right, especially when Kearns is making conclusions of economics, right, and also, well, this could apply to other disciplines like mechanics and astronomy. So Kearns says that when applied to facts, right, can only be said to be true in the absence of disturbing causes, which is, in other words, to say that they are true on the hypothesis that the premises include all the causes affecting the result. And of course, in our modeling, it's very, very hard to include all these things because, ladies and gentlemen, a set of premises can be incomplete in many ways. First, failing to list all relevant causes, right? And if you fail to list all relevant causes, then you violate the concept of truth. Remember, knowledge is justified true beliefs. So if you fail to include all those aspects, right, that somehow affect that particular premise that you are putting across, then you violate that. Now, the second aspect is that you fail to explicitly list all the implicitly required idealizations. And of course, when this happens, you hide. So at this stage here, there is hiding its violations of nothing but truth, ladies and gentlemen. So the first is the sense we find in carelessness in the passage that I have just given you. So that enables carelessness to claim that the premises can be true, even if incomplete. And that's where we need to really start from. Now, in the modeling style, which is characteristic of the 19th century economics, such idealizations, and even many of them, typically are not explicitly listed. We know that very well. And such idealizations are typically false if taken as claims about the world. And of course, this is very, very important. I think what I'll do, let me just present to you another scholar who has presented models and theories that are questionable. Again, that's why we need to critique, right, these theories, and if possible, dismiss and come up with the new theories. Right, I'll give you an example of Theorem in 1826, right? So that is a strikingly modern approach which was pursued by J.H. von Theorem in 1826, right? Now, Theorem formulated a model of agricultural land use that has many characteristics of the 20th century idea of economic model. And he shared the idea that a model would only include a small set of causally relevant factors. That's what he did. Two, he also formulated his model using a number of explicitly stated idealizing assumptions, of which he knew they were false. I can give you those assumptions. The first assumption is the region being of homogeneous fertility and climate. And that is not possible. You can't talk about homogeneous fertility and homogeneous climate. They are usually variations, right? Then the second assumption he made was that, and this is really an idealizing assumption, which was devoid, that the area was devoid of mountains and valleys and rivers and canals. It's very, really inconceivable for you to think that you can have a country like Uganda without mountains, without rivers, without valleys, and without swamps and so forth, and you start coming up with a model of a physical distribution, for instance. It does not really work. Right, and these are some of the weaknesses of the model. So he went ahead and just put one town in the middle and no connections with the outer world. And that's the works of von Theorem. So the point of the model was to try and isolate the causal role of distance from the town of course, which was mediated by transportation costs and land rents. And of course, the point of the model was in shaping the land use structure in the region. Now, from what we see, ladies and gentlemen, especially from that model of Thunen, right, you see, he came up with something that he presented, a pattern in the model which had concentric rings, and of course to him he thought that was empirically accurate, but it was empirically inaccurate about any actual land use structure, often by wide margins, ladies and gentlemen. So this is really surprising, but we can also say unsurprising, given that economists tend to use assumptions. So we need to interrogate even the assumptions that are used in modeling, because I know in econometrics, many of us actually hide behind econometrics and we say the model is robust, etc. But we need to interrogate those behavioral aspects behind the models that we come up with, ladies and gentlemen. So having talked about von Thunen and having also given you examples of MATLAB, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to turn to the essay that was written by Friedman in 1953, so that we also interrogate Friedman's model, because I know that Milton Friedman somehow guides our thinking in the area of economics. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say that the realist tradition has been supposed to be discontinued with Milton Friedman's and Fried MATLAB's statements in the early 1950s. Now, I know that the interpretation of Friedman's 1953 will make us understand these issues of isolated idealizations. Now, when we look at the Friedman's 1953 essay and we attempt to interpret what that essay says in part, we discover that the essay takes on what we call the anti-realist and instrumentalist manifesto. And given the fact that Friedman's statement is typically taken to correctly characterize the theories, to characterize practices, to characterize attitudes of mainstream economists, and also practices and attitudes, then we need to really think about Friedman's concepts or ideas that have been presented over time, ladies and gentlemen. Now, from the essay given by Friedman, one, ladies and gentlemen, can argue that this is not quite accurate, and that Friedman's essay can be read as a realist statement and therefore not at all entirely out of phase with the earlier traditions. And that is a thinking that you can have at the back of your mind, but we can also say that on realism in Friedman's economics, especially when you see the works of Hoover, 2009, the elements of realism comes out. So I know there are those scholars who think that Friedman is anti-realist, while others they think that Friedman is realist. Anyway, there is a debate that is ongoing, and debate will always be there. But I just want to take you to the element of modeling, and that's my interest today, so that we know how the common sensibles come into the model, ladies and gentlemen. So, as you can see, Friedman had set out to defend conventional theory. He wanted to defend conventional theory, in particular the model of perfect competition and the assumption of profit maximization, against the criticism that had been made against their unrealisticness, right? So Friedman granted that many such assumptions, right, very important. So when Friedman set out and he wanted to defend that assumption of profit maximization, of course, his works drew from the works of previous scholars in the discipline. Friedman granted that many such assumptions were indeed unrealistic, but that this is irrelevant to the scientific value, or more strongly, a virtue in that truly important and significant hypothesis will be found. So you find that in the works of Friedman, 1953, page 13. We can actually quote that, but in the interest of time, I will not really go into quoting that, but look at his essay, Friedman's essay, 1953, and go to page 13. You will see that quote, and I've just left it out. So he came up with a very nice model, which is very insightful, right? And of course, his works have also been critiqued, as I've already said. And many commentators have concluded that Friedman is committed to an instrumentalist conception of scientific theory. They have also said that Friedman is uninterested in having true theories about the world. And that's their thinking. So they actually go ahead and say that while very insightful, Friedman's essay is also terribly confused and ambiguous. They actually say is confused and ambiguous, sorry, not unambiguous, but ambiguous, so readers can take liberties to provide their own favorite interpretations. And whenever something is ambiguous, somebody can provide or can take his or her own interpretations about that particular aspect. Right, so if we take a realist reading, right, and I'll give you an example of what Friedman writes in his essay 1953 on page 15. And I'm going to quote, ladies and gentlemen, I'm quoting Friedman. So Friedman says this, open the quote, the relevant questions to ask about the assumptions of a theory is whether they are sufficiently good approximations for the purpose at hand. And that's what Friedman says, right? So as you can see, there is a fact of the matter as to how the assumptions relate to the world and whether this is sufficiently good depending on the pragmatics. And therefore, the prediction becomes very relevant in this case. So if you're using a theory to be a net that you use to capture reality out there, meaning that you can also predict behavior in that particular environment using the same net, then you need to be very, very, very careful. So we need to come up with a theory that is sufficient to explain behavior over time, ladies and gentlemen. So you will continue reading Friedman's essays. I gave you an example, page 12, page 15, page 41, extra and extra. So you can say etc, etc, etc. So I will not really continue with that discussion at this material time, but find time and read. After all, that's a book I gave you. So, but let me just say that one of Friedman's example is Galileo's law of freely falling bodies. And of course, when you look at that law, it's associated with the assumption of air pressure being zero. So there is an assumption that air pressure is zero, so that bodies fall in a vacuum, right? Unfortunately, that assumption may not be there. So these are mostly false assumptions that play the role of helping to isolate the impact of Earth's gravity from other causal influences on the falling body, ladies and gentlemen. So in the analogy that Friedman himself missed in his essay, one can construe the profit maximization assumption as involving the composite, right, idealization, and that all other motives except the maximization motive have zero strength. And therefore, the general realistic, what you call realist principle is that theory construction is a matter of theoretical isolation, whereby economists abstract essential features of complex reality out there. And of course, that will help you to come up with theories that are able to explain reality out there, ladies and gentlemen. So these aspects are very important, and allow me at this material time to take you to another component of closed systems, so that we discuss ontology versus methodology. Right. Now, if you recall at the beginning of this course, I told you that when we are doing research, because we are interested in creating knowledge and explaining reality out there, so we deal with the issues of ontology, we deal with the issues of epistemology, we deal with the issues of axiology, we deal with the issues of methodology, and we move down to methods. And therefore, the methodology, or even the methods that you choose, will always draw from the ontological and epistemological perspectives of the study and axiological perspectives. So you cannot actually dismiss these things. So therefore, at this mature time in economics, we want to draw our attention and discussion to the closed systems, so that we start discussing now issues of ontology versus methodology. So, ladies and gentlemen, our discussions show how isolative theories and models based on idealizing assumptions are in line with scientific realism. And this is not the only account available under the label of realism in the philosophy of economics, right? So, in economics, there is a different understanding of realism, whose components have argued otherwise, drawing their inspiration from the works of Roy Basker's work. So you can refer to Basker 1975, you can refer to Rawson 1997, and you can refer to Rawson 1999. Now, in that, in their works, we see that their claim is that in its modeling practices, mainstream economics depicts the economy as consisting of a closed system. I'm sure you are aware of that. A closed system within which regular connections obtain between observable events, and that's what it is. So economics is thereby committed to a closed system ontology. We are talking about reality. Now, reality that is closed is very hard to find, but of course assumptions are made. So economics is thereby committed to a closed systems ontology and an associated Humean ontology of event regularities. And that's what they do when they are trying to understand the real causal mechanisms in our environment, so in our modeling process. So the underlying real causal mechanisms are not really accessed by the methods that we use in modeling events in economics. So this positivistic, which is a positivist and deductivist package, essentially includes the extensive use of mathematics in creating and examining such observed systems phenomenon. So in economics, the modeling bit of it has a lot of mathematics in it. So when you start thinking about the other perspectives, they will certainly be left out. So it's important for us to understand the mathematics, that is very fine, but also not to lose out the common sensibles, because a closed system is very important. No wonder Rawson 1999, I think it's around page 273, He simply says that the generalized use of formalistic economic methods presupposes that the social world is everywhere closed. You find that in Lawson, 1999, page 273. So, given that the real social world is open rather than closed, ladies and gentlemen, and given the fact that causal mechanisms rather than invent regularities are the real basis of social phenomenon, mainstream economics is non-realist in this perspective. But we can also say that this perspective is questionable. So this is a debate that we need to understand. So the correct observation is that economists use methods of isolation, especially those methods that are used in building and examining, and they're used in building and examining models that depict closed systems in some obvious sense, and that they use formal techniques in doing this. So it is incorrect to infer from this observation that the practice is somehow committed to the ontology of closed systems and event regularities, ladies and gentlemen. So to do so is to conflate methodology and ontology, to commit a fallacy of mistaking closed systems methods for a closed systems ontology. So as I told you, all this is literature, these ideas that we pick from literature, therefore it's a debate. So instead of economists use closed systems methods, right? Instead of their use of the closed systems method, implying economists are committed to a closed systems ontology, the more likely correct inference would be from economists believing that the social world is very complex to open system, and that's the complex perspective that I've been giving you from time to time. Economics is complex because it deals with the complex issues, ladies and gentlemen. So those are very important aspects. Allow me now to move to what I will call possibly the last part of our discussion under common sensibles. Right, so can we then look at modeling invisible hand mechanism? How possible and how realistic is it for us to start modeling invisible hand mechanism? And what are the philosophical perspectives in this case? So, ladies and gentlemen, mechanism, as you can see here, is one of the most popular words used by economists, right? They will talk about the price mechanism, the market mechanism. So, the word mechanism is actually in the common usage of economists, right? They even talk about systems, price system, right? A perfectly competitive mechanism, a perfectly competitive system. So the word mechanism and the word system often surfaces. So how can we then model this element that we call the invisible hand mechanism? So mechanism is one of the most popular words used by economists. Indeed, economists believe to be modeling, economists believe to be modeling mechanisms of a variety of different kinds. So that's why they will talk about modeling, right? In fact, if you have a background in economics and you do not really talk about model specification, it means that you have not gone through that kind of training. Whereas in other disciplines, they will talk about conceptual models, theoretical models, and they will draw diagrams showing the relationship between these things, right? Economists will come up with a mathematical formulation of course in form of complicated either simultaneous equations or in form of matrices, if you are talking about the confirmatory issues of a construct in this case. So these mathematical expressions will be seen from time to time. But remember, they will be talking about mechanism, right? They will be talking about systems, but representing that with mathematical formulations, right? Meaning that at the end of the day, that reality will be seen as a closed system. So as you can see here, economists believe to be modeling mechanisms of a variety of different kinds. And many of these mechanisms have an invisible hand structure. Individuals with behavioral dispositions and powers act in pursuit of their individual goals. So these are coordinated by some social structure, such as some market, or what you call market-like mechanisms, and some aggregate level outcome will be produced at the end of the day, but not in virtue of individuals aiming at it. So the invisible hand can generate welfare-enhancing outcomes in the spirit of, for instance, Mandeville's private vices, public virtues, as well as suboptimal outcomes of the prisoner's dilemma type, mediated by the invisible backhand, right? So if you go through literature, that is what you discover. So invisible hand mechanisms often produce, ladies and gentlemen, counterintuitive outcomes in the sense that they appear surprising or paradoxical from the point of view of ordinary uneducated point of view. And that's why we need to be very cautious about what is done and interrogate those concepts. So indeed, ladies and gentlemen, there is often a conflict between economic theory and the common sense understanding of how the economy works, manifesting in conflicting perceptions such as free trade versus protectionisms, or growing government budget deficit versus spending cuts during recession, and so forth. So you may come up with all those models. Let me just take an example of Uganda. Uganda as a country is 90% informal, most likely, and about 10% formal. Now, if you look at the activities in the informal sector and the activities in the formal sector in most cases, and you come up with the models to begin modeling the informal sector, you are deceiving. So in most cases, the data and statistics that used in modeling are picked from the formal sector. And there's a general thinking at the end of the day after getting results that all these results refer to the entire economy. Right, but remember 90% of the economy is informal, ladies and gentlemen. So you have informal activities, informal transfers, informal interactions, and all these cannot be really modeled, ladies and gentlemen, through those complicated mathematical expressions, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why when you begin talking about how the economy works, right, then you'll have conflicting perceptions, right? So we'll be talking about free trade versus protectionism, right? Right? Free trade, but at the same time, there's that restrictive bit. You'll be talking about growing government budget deficit, right? And then you start talking about spending cuts during recession. Sometimes when you examine these issues, you begin knowing that there's a dilemma that needs to be addressed. So this might be taken to speak against the idea that economics is about common sensibles, ladies and gentlemen. So as I come to close of this lecture, because I want to really close this lecture right now, we can say that from what we've been discussing, right, the familiar common sensibles are both modified and rearranged in the theoretical economics. And the modification we are talking about is modification by idealization and abstraction and modeling and the averaging that is done by economists. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for attending this lecture. I hope you have picked something from this lecture, and do not forget to go and download those books that I asked you to download and read, and so that at the end of the day we are on the same page. We are reading the same page. So this was a lecture on the topic realism and anti-realism about economics, but more so talking about common sensibles and their modifications in economic modeling. We have specifically covered isolation by idealization. We have looked at Friedman's 1953 essay and attempted to critique that essay. We have also covered closed systems by looking at ontology versus methodology. And we have also covered modeling invisible hand mechanisms. In our next lecture, ladies and gentlemen, we intend to go into realism in economics, but more so talking about social construction of reality. I want to wish you a nice time. Stay well, stay safe. Let's meet next time. Bye.